In ancient Egypt, a series of legendary pharaohs have built the most iconic monuments in history. Generations of builders have toiled on these giant pyramids, transforming the country and uniting its people, in the hope of guaranteeing eternal life for their pharaoh. But cracks in the country's unity are beginning to show.
Increasing amounts of power are held in the provinces independent of the king.
There are like little local pharaohs all throughout Egypt.
Religious transformation.
The king could appear here on top to demonstrate himself as the sun god.
Climate change.
It's a perfect storm. Everything disintegrates.
And a weak pharaoh bring the age of the pyramids to a crushing end. The story of the pyramids is one of innovation.
It was a resurrection machine.
Mysterious rituals.
These are things that help the deceased re-energize and live for eternity.
Back-breaking work and palace intrigue. Unlock the deepest secrets of the pharaohs.
Every mummy is different. You never know exactly what to expect.
Explore the lives of ancient workers and uncover the remarkable story of Egypt's old kingdom.
Not only did ancient Egypt make the pyramids made ancient Egypt.
(2150 BC). A weak and aging pharaoh reigns over Egypt. His name is Pepi II. All over the kingdom, people are rising up against a king they believe has lost the favor of the gods. The harvest has been poor for several years. The people are hungry, and revolution is brewing. Pepi II doesn't know it, but he will be the last pharaoh of the Old Kingdom. To understand how this powerful empire began to crumble, we must travel back to a time 300 years before Pepi came to power. To the Giza Plateau and the two largest pyramids in Egyptian history, each over 450 feet tall. They were built by the legendary pharaoh Khufu and his son Khafre. But when Khafre's son, the pharaoh Menkaure, orders a new pyramid on the plateau, something has changed. The last pyramid at Giza is surprising for its modest proportions. It tops out at just over 200 feet.
They did go bigger and bigger, but then with Menkaure, we get a dramatic reduction. The base area of Menkaure's pyramid is about a quarter the area of Khufu's pyramid.
What pushed Menkaure, a pharaoh from an illustrious lineage, to build so small? Why did he allow his memory to be relegated in history by building in the shadow of his powerful predecessors?
Is that for lack of resources? Is it a change of heart? Does he tend to focus on his temple construction?
Mark Lehner thinks that the bedrock of the plateau, known geologically as the Mokattam Formation, could hold clues.
What's going on with Menkaure? One idea is that he's running out of space. The pyramids are aligned on this great diagonal on the Mokattam Formation. Menkaure's pyramid is right at the edge of the formation. He's running out of good, solid foundation to build a pyramid. That's one idea.
That's a practical explanation. But there's another theory that could explain the smaller pyramid. and eventual downfall of the empire.
For generations in the Fourth Dynasty, you have innovations going on in architecture, with labor, with administration, and with the movement of materials. There was a tremendous amount of wear and tear on the people, on the land, on the economy. It just simply wasn't sustainable. By the time of Menkaure, it seems that the resources for the building of pyramids were almost exhausted.
Menkaure was also worried about the time he had to build his pyramid tomb.
You have to have the confidence of a long life to lay out a base area that's as large as Khufu's or Khafre's. So he may not have thought he had that long to be on the throne.
There is evidence that Menkaure compensated for size with style. Today, traces of reddish rock at the foot of the pyramid hint at the king's plan. He encases the lower third of his monument with expensive red granite.
The granite that Menkaure uses in his pyramid probably came from as far afield as Aswan on the very southern border of Egypt. So Menkaure's pyramid is smaller, but it also incorporates some much more expensive stone to haul all the way to the Giza Plateau.
The king may have planned to cover even more than a third of his pyramid.
And some people think that, in fact, he was going to take this red granite all the way to the top, which would be very unusual.
Perhaps Menkaure decides that a fancy exterior is better use of his limited time and resources. But even this is never finished. Around 2440 BC, Menkaure dies.
Unlike the other two kings buried in Giza, Menkaure died before finishing his pyramid.
His son and successor, Shepseskaf, has to complete the job in a hurry, and he seems to have other plans. When this new king plans a tomb for himself, he breaks with tradition. He builds 15 miles away from Giza in South Saqqara. And Shepseskaf does not build a pyramid. He builds a low, flat tomb called a mastaba, the shape that royal tombs were traditionally built before the age of the pyramids. Shepseskaf is the last pharaoh in what modern historians refer to as a dynasty, a family who passed kingship within the same bloodline. The era of the giant pyramid builders began with Djoser at the start of the Third Dynasty. It ends with Shepseskaf, the last king of the Fourth Dynasty.
The Fourth Dynasty ends when a new family takes control of Egypt, and that begins with Userkaf of the Fifth Dynasty.
Exactly how Userkaf takes control is a mystery.
We believe that King Userkaf, the founder of the Fifth Dynasty, was not of royal blood.
But he will make a series of choices that will lead to the disintegration of the empire.
When Userkaf comes to the throne, once again, kingship is rebranded.
What Userkaf does on a monumental scale is essentially let everyone know, in case you didn't realize, there are major changes afoot here. So I am the proper successor, and yet I'm not following in the footsteps of my predecessors.
Userkaf decides to transform the tradition of pyramid building. He builds his tomb next to Egypt's very first pyramid at Saqqara, but he puts little effort into it. Today, it is not much more than a ruin, a pile of sand and rock. But why? What's changed? Archaeologist Massimiliano Nizzolo thinks the answer is hidden under the desert sands, at a place called Abu Ghurab, between Saqqara and Giza.
This is the sun temple of one of the rulers of the 5th dynasty. And this temple was built about 100 years after the pyramids of Giza. There is a big change in the architecture in the 5th dynasty. No more giant pyramids, no more big architecture, but a huge temple dedicated specifically to the cult of the sun god. And through the cult of the sun god to the cult of the king.
During this time period, the sun god Ra becomes the most important god in Egypt. The pharaoh Userkaf now presents himself as Ra's one and only son. The king's priorities have changed, and it will have a profound effect on Egypt. In Egypt, the first king of the 5th dynasty, Userkaf, has thrown out tradition. He builds a tiny pyramid, but a grand new type of monument, a solar temple.
The 5th dynasty rulers didn't stop the construction of the pyramids, but they put most of the energy in this sun temple.
They built them here, at a place called Abu Ghurab.
It's very interesting to note that Abu Ghurab is placed in such a way to be in the middle, between the big pyramids of Giza to the north and the pyramid of Nefru to the south. This is of course not by chance, it's intentional. The king wanted to stand exactly in the middle of his ancestors in order to be visible to them and also to interact symbolically with them, to demonstrate he was the legitimate successor of the big kings of Giza and Dashur.
This is the solar temple of a king called Nusra, who carried on this new tradition. It's dedicated to the worship of the sun god Ra.
A clear example of this is this unique area of purification composed of these 10 basins of alabaster. The priests were pouring the water into the basin, and through this hole, the basin was flowing on a pavement with channels going in the east-west direction, so following the cycle of the sun and reenacting every day the Nile flood, because the Nile is in Egypt the real source of life, and is also associated with the energy of the sun god. So sun and water together can regenerate nature.
These purification basins are each carved out of a massive block of alabaster, a rare and precious stone hauled here from quarries 200 miles away. They sit at the base of the most important symbol of this temple, an obelisk, the ruins of which are still visible today.
So we have to imagine this construction as an obelisk, but don't imagine monolithic and slender pieces of granite. Here the obelisk was probably built of blocks of stone, limestone in particular.
Massimiliano has discovered a special stone that reveals exactly what the monument once looked like.
Well, this granite block is very interesting because it's the only block where we have the original name of the temple that you can see here, at least in part. The temple was called Shesepibra. This was the sound of ancient Egyptian, and it would look like something, the place of the joy of Ra. And here especially, with my finger, I can point to the hieroglyphic sign that was indicating the original shape of the temple.
Ancient builders constructed an obelisk some 65 feet high, standing in the center of a wide building which the king would enter during rituals.
Nowadays, this monument is very damaged and it's open to the sun. But you have to imagine that in the antiquity, in the time of Nusra, we were entering a very dark space there is a sort of theatrical trick. The king was entering the darkness of this corridor, and then he would have reappeared on top of the obelisk as the new shining sun.
Massimiliano has been able to identify the ritual path Nusra walked during the most important ceremonies. They took place during the winter and summer solstices, when the days were the shortest or longest of the year.
Here you have one block. This is all that remains of the ceiling that was once covering the inner corridor of the building. And on this side, we have also decoration of the original ceiling with a starry sky. You can still see some blue color. So after having climbed the obelisk, the king could appear again here on top to demonstrate himself as the sun god. And you have to imagine all people gathering downstairs around the altar and celebrating the new appearance of the sun god, or the king as the sun god.
A new temple to empower the sun cult, born in the 5th dynasty with Nusra's predecessor, Userkaf.
But also, I would say this idea does not really come from Nusra. The first king of the 5th dynasty, Userkaf, put his temple just 400 meters to the south of this one, in the same position. So this idea comes indeed from Userkaf, from the beginning of the 5th dynasty.
Userkaf's decision to build a grand solar temple and elevate the importance of the sun god Ra will transform Egypt, just as the first pyramids had generations before. From now on, the pharaohs will funnel resources into building grand solar temples. Their pyramids will get smaller. Just like Userkaf, they will celebrate the sun, the primordial source of all life.
The pyramids tend to shrink in size, but the temples get more elaborate, more different materials, more inscriptions, more elaboration.
One way to look at Userkaf's constructions is to say that he needlessly diverted funds and work and material from his pyramid to a separate mortuary monument. On the other hand, he may be responding to certain changes in the priesthood and Egyptian religion. He's clearly wanting to emphasize certain aspects of the solar cult.
The solar temple is a sign of the rising power of priests, who left offerings at a sun-shaped altar every day. The walls of tombs from the time reveal clues about the rituals performed here. Every morning, priests expose animals to the first rays of the sun before taking them to the solar temple. They lead them into the inner courtyard. This cow will be sacrificed to the sun god Ra. The choice cuts, such as the right front leg of cattle, are offered to the god Ra to gain his favor. But the priests and their assistants get the rest. The clergy of the solar cult will grow ever more powerful and numerous.
With the building of the sun temples, you find another innovative type of architecture. But this also shows the rising power of the Ra priesthood and how much that priesthood has to be fed.
But it's interesting that it's focused on what we might consider a separate but parallel solar cult represented by the solar monument. So we seem to see a kind of a trickle down of the wealth and authority. No longer is everything focused purely on the king.
The pharaoh himself becomes increasingly isolated. He alone is the son of Ra, To affirm his divine nature, he devotes himself to the solar cult and puts ever less time into the day-to-day management of his country. In the palace, the pharaoh will no longer meet with his court. The king is creating a rift that will fracture the country. The pharaoh Userkaf is becoming increasingly isolated from his people. Now, he even denies his ruling elite the opportunity to be buried alongside their king.
In the 5th dynasty, there is a big shift between the king and his subjects. That's a big difference with the Giza pyramid.
At Giza, a huge necropolis spreads out around the pyramids of the earlier pharaohs, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Their families and privileged members of their court rest for all eternity at the side of the pharaohs they served, granted immortality by proxy.
All the kings of the 5th dynasty had a completely different idea, to be secluded from all the other subjects. And the king is standing alone in the center of this site to be represented as the son of the sun god. So seclusion, isolation, to demonstrate that he's the only representative of the sun god on earth.
Userkaf and his successors claim that they alone are blessed by the sun god Ra. Ordinary people will have to look elsewhere. And they do.
And that's for this reason that in the 5th dynasty we have also the appearance of the god Osiris. That's a very important figure of Egyptian religion.
Osiris is judge of the dead and lord of the underworld.
Osiris appears for the first time in the tombs of the people buried in Saqqara. So it seems that the king gave these people the possibility to have a personal god, a personal deity, Osiris, whereas he had his own deity, the sun god.
As Userkaf and his successors become ever more distant from the affairs of state, the administration of the kingdom is left in the hands of bureaucrats and high-ranking civil servants, the class created by the pyramid construction projects of previous kings.
When Userkaf takes the throne, he makes a conscious effort to move the power out of the royal family, which is where it's been through most of the 4th dynasty, mainly to circumvent rival princes.
There are more officials. They're not just the nearest family members of the king. Now there's a professional bureaucracy. And so the interesting thing is the bureaucracy in the state is expanding just as the pyramids are decreasing.
During Userkaf's reign, he starts to spread out his power amongst officials by marrying out his daughters to officials that were the elite within the ancient Egyptian society. I don't think he thinks about the long-term ramifications of this strategy politically.
By ceding power and status to local officials, the king is becoming less relevant to the ordinary people of Egypt. The change initiated by Userkaf will create a seismic shift in power. One that Egyptologists have exposed by examining the tomb of a powerful bureaucrat called Mereruka. This man was given the job of vizier by King Teti, the founder of the 6th dynasty, who let Mereruka marry his daughter.
Mereruka has a mastaba tomb located a stone's throw from Teti's pyramid at Saqqara, and inside the tomb are reliefs that tell us so much about what Mereruka's life was like.
It offers a unique glimpse into the lives of the court elite at the time, including his favorite hobbies: hunting, fishing in the marshes, and relaxing with his wife, Princess Sesheshet. She plays the harp for him and joins him for a board game called Senet.
These are the sorts of details that really give a richness to our understanding of life in ancient Egypt. We even have the lyrics of the songs that the women were singing.
Life seems sweet, but there is also evidence of a brutal authoritarian state. On one of the walls of Mereruka's tomb, engravers carved scenes depicting what happens to anyone who breaks the law. A local chief is accused of not paying Mereruka the pharaoh's tax. He is said to have hidden part of his village's harvest. A bold move.
This scene is unique because it tells us that the power of the country is declining. Before that time, people couldn't do this.
Scribes record the offense and the punishment in their archives. The administrator of the district orders him to be escorted to a public area. Then, tied to a pole in full view of everyone, he receives his sentence. A caning. The tomb inscriptions reveal a rising new tension in the country. It's divided into administrative regions called nomes, each with their own symbol. There are 22 along the Nile in Upper Egypt, and about 20 more in Lower Egypt, dotted through the Delta region. The capital at Memphis is no longer in total control.
Really beginning in the 5th dynasty and picking up pace in the 6th, we start to see that the complexity of the local administration must be growing, and it's necessary now to have an official per district, and that person probably needs to be spending a fair amount of their time in that district.
If these officials start to focus on just their own region, just their own province, then they become what's called a nomarch, a sort of governor of a region or a precinct or a district or a nome. And then why are they as interested in supporting the pharaoh and the state?
If your family was already in charge, then that same family would continue to hold power. And what this means is that increasing amounts of political and economic power are held in the provinces independent of the king.
There are like little local pharaohs all throughout Egypt. Those officials began building their own monumental tombs. Starting in the next dynasty, whole family tombs appear in the provinces.
The power that was given to non-royal individuals was very difficult to be taken back again. So we have the king in the capital, and we have those powerful people ruling and governing their nomes within their families.
The growing power of these civil servants begins to threaten the monarchy.
You find various types of decrees that give evidence that Pharaoh is having to give up various control over certain estates or individuals and inabilities to tax them. And so that means that some of the provinces are getting more powerful.
So that may have actually decreased Pharaoh's wealth. At least it distributed it more widely.
From the 5th dynasty, the pharaohs increasingly lose their superiority in the nomes. The future of Egypt as a unified kingdom is now at risk. In ancient Egypt, the pyramid of the 5th dynasty, King Unas, hides evidence of a growing unease among royalty. Underground, the king covered his burial chamber's walls in mysterious writing. They are now known as the pyramid texts.
These are texts that decorated the king's burial chamber that give instructions and recitations to the king to make his journey into the next world where he'll become one of the gods of the circumpolar northern stars.
They are a set of spells designed to help the king join with the heavens, join with the gods, defeat bothersome and threatening enemies, and the orientation and layout on the various rooms are significant as well.
Oh, Unas, the messengers of your Ka come to you. The messengers of your father come to you. The messengers of Ra come to
you. Words that ensure the pharaoh's immortality, written down for the first time.
The very first example is at the end of Dynasty V, the last king of Dynasty V, King Unas, at Saqqara. At Giza, the three pyramids are not inscribed, so we don't have pyramid text there.
The later pharaohs may be aware that they are losing their grip on the kingdom and cannot rely on future generations to know these spells or perform them.
Perhaps one of the reasons that the pyramid texts are inscribed inside the pyramid. Perhaps the kings were worried that the rituals and the offerings will not be given in the temples.
No rituals, no eternal life.
They start as pyramid texts for royalty. They morph or evolve into the coffin texts in the Middle Kingdom, available to non-royals as well. And by the New Kingdom, they're called the Book of the Dead. So all of these are collections of spells meant to guarantee a successful afterlife for the deceased.
The kings must ensure that they can survive in the afterlife, but also maintain control and unity of their kingdom in the real world. A challenge for pharaohs whose influence decreases the further from their capital of Memphis they go. A recent and remarkable discovery gives evidence of the dramatic shift. The find was made in the south of Egypt, in the region of Aswan. During antiquity, this was the first nome of Upper Egypt and the furthest from the capital. It was known as the Nome of the Countries of the Ark. On this rocky hill on the west bank of the Nile, facing Aswan, a German-Egyptian team is excavating an area that has never been investigated before. Friederike Seyfried is the director of the Egyptological Museum in Berlin. She has spent 4 years excavating the tomb of a local dignitary, the ruler or nomarch of this area.
We are at the region called Kubbat el-Hawa North. And what you see here is a very large ancient staircase because the funeral is coming from the River Nile, so they are proceeding the steps upwards to the entrance of the tomb, which is a tomb of the late 6th dynasty belonging to a certain person named Khonis. Khonis was, of course, a privileged person because only privileged person could afford to have a rock-cut tomb of such a size. They wanted to have tombs which mark their position, and you want to show your richness and your property. This is something which is, of course, impressive for everybody. The quality of the rock is poor. But having such a view over the River Nile is so beautiful that you will accept the bad rock.
Egyptologists discovered this tomb after the events of the Arab Spring in 2014, during which some locals looked for antiquities to sell. The tomb raiders unearthed the burial chamber, which had remained sealed for more than 4,000 years.
The first thing what you see are two pillars, left and right, through the entrance. And both pillars were decorated. And you see a small servant having an incense burner in his hand. Incense is still something for purification. That one is bringing something to drink. Yeah? This is a typical beer jar, because you have to drink and eat in the nether world. It is fantastic to see that you have these two servants coming directly inside the tomb and giving the offering for Hunis, who should be buried, of course, in the burial chamber here.
In this room, archaeologists found a few small bones. The looters had taken everything else.
So you have the second row of pillars here. You have here the depiction of the tomb owner. Here you have the title, Hunis. So he was the sealer of the king. He was a friend at the courtyard, and he was a priest. He was really a distinguished person of the elite of the late Old Kingdom.
The tomb is a perfect illustration of the changing power structure in Egypt. It reveals that Kunis was styling himself as a regional pharaoh in his own right.
If you are wealthy enough to build up such a tomb, you are really a person of the elite. It is something which shows the richness of the people here. There are many tombs in Egypt which are not decorated, which have no inscriptions. And when we came in, for us it was fantastic to see these depictions and a relief on the wall and the name, at least the name of the tomb owner. So this was really fantastic for us.
But this tomb would be amongst the last of its kind. In the capital of Memphis, 500 miles away, a young pharaoh ascends the throne of Egypt. This is Pepi II, and under his rule, Egypt's old kingdom will finally collapse. In ancient Egypt, around 2216 BC, Pepi II is crowned king. He is only 6 years old. He will rule Egypt longer than any other king before. Too long, as history will show. When the king reaches 36 years of age, he seeks to solidify his power with a symbolic gesture.
After 30 years on the throne, a king celebrated the Jubilee Festival, literally called the Heb-Sed, or the Festival of the Tail. And what the Jubilee Festival meant was a renewal of kingship. So after 30 years on the throne, Pepi II would have renewed his kingship by celebrating the Jubilee.
This was a kind of recharge the batteries celebration where the king demonstrates the fact that he deserves to stay on the throne.
Several physical and symbolic events make up this ritual, which traditionally takes place in the courtyard next to Egypt's very first pyramid at Saqqara. In one, the king runs around a marker 4 times in one direction and 4 in another to take symbolic possession of his kingdom. During another ritual test, Pepi II must prove his archery skills in front of his entire court. He shoots arrows in the direction of the cardinal points to symbolically show his command over the universe. At the time of his first Heb-Sed festival, the pharaoh is still young and in good shape. But as time goes by, the monarch begins to show signs of weakness. Every 3 years, he undertakes another festival, inadvertently showcasing his decline. Egyptologists think that Pepi II reigned for at least 63 years. It must be clear to Pepi's people that he's no longer in control. And a catastrophe is about to add to the king's problems.
Towards the end of the reign of Pepi II, there seemed to be a series of low Nile floods. And when there was less of a flood, there would also be less agricultural production. So a series of low Nile floods would result in scarcer food and a greater strain of any food that had been stored.
For an ordinary ancient Egyptian, the king is everything. He's a living god. He's a representative of all the gods. So it means if there are no flood, it means the king is responsible. The king is responsible to bring the water every year.
It's a perfect storm. You have massive famine going on in the country. You have a lessened power of the pharaonic state. The king has succession problems. Pepi II simply lived too long. And on top of that, you have a separation between the king and his officials.
Ordinary Egyptians believed that the gods had abandoned the pharaoh. The nomarchs in the provinces took this as an opportunity to secede from the kingdom.
You've relied on the system of a powerful king who redistributes taxes through grain and food across the country in times of incredible stress, such as a drought. And you don't have that resource anymore. So having a system that's fragmented and broken and no centralized government is highly problematic.
And so what happens? Everything disintegrates, and they end up in a civil war with small little kinglets fighting amongst themselves. And the king, once so powerful during the Great Pyramid Age, has vanished into the shadows.
Today, Pepi II is known as the pharaoh responsible for the end of the first golden age of Egyptian civilization, the era we now call the Old Kingdom, or the Pyramid Age. But pyramids themselves didn't completely disappear.
They started building pyramids again in the Middle Kingdom, but they're less well known. Now they're building pyramids a little bit out of stone, but mostly out of mud brick. They carried on into late antiquity, of course, in Nubia. So pyramids had a long run.
the fragmentation of the country and the end of the Old Kingdom did not spell the end of Egyptian civilization. A few centuries after the reign of Pepi II, Egypt will reinvent itself. New pharaohs will unite the territories of the north and the south. They will reconstruct the state and reweave a common identity. These new pharaohs will rely on the incredible advances made by their forebears. They will use the engineering skills and organizational structure that built the pyramids. It's the legacy of the pyramids that will rebuild Egypt itself.